Imagine a man who did absolutely everything right, a highly disciplined guy who spent 5 agonizing years meticulously studying the financial markets, living way below his means, and steadily building his investment portfolio from a few $1,000s into a massive, life-changing fortune of over $2 million, feeling like an absolute genius who had finally escaped the matrix and completely outsmarted the entire global financial system. But then, on one random Tuesday morning, human greed took over and he decided that $2 million simply was not enough. Because he wanted to buy a massive mansion, quit his job immediately, and buy a fleet of supercars to prove his success to everyone who ever doubted him, so he took his entire life savings, leveraged it to the absolute maximum limit using borrowed money from his broker, and placed one single, massive, wildly aggressive bet on a tech stock that he was absolutely, mathematically certain was going to explode. But instead of going up to the moon, the market experienced a sudden, violent, completely unpredictable flash crash that lasted exactly 14 minutes. And in those 14 agonizing minutes, the broker's automated algorithms mercilessly liquidated his entire heavily leveraged account just to cover the borrowed money, meaning that when the dust finally settled and the screen stopped flashing red, the man who had spent 5 brutal years building a $2 million empire was left sitting in his chair in absolute, deafening silence with a completely empty bank account, mathematically ruined and forced to start completely from scratch. This horrific, gut-wrenching story is not just a theoretical warning, it is playing out millions of times every single day across the modern digital economy, and it perfectly illustrates the absolute most important and most frequently ignored piece of financial wisdom in human history, famously spoken by Warren Buffett, who said that rule number 1 of investing is to never lose money, and rule number 2 is to never forget rule number 1. On the surface, this sounds like a cute, sarcastic, incredibly obvious piece of advice from a billionaire grandpa, but beneath that simple sentence lies the most brutal, unforgiving, and terrifying mathematical law of the financial universe, known by professionals as the velocity of ruin. And today on Pratibodh Wisedom, we are going to break down exactly why your biological desire to get rich quick is mathematically guaranteeing that you will stay completely broke forever, and exactly how to use Buffett's boring rules to build an unshakable empire. Chapter 1. The Asymmetry of Loss and the Mathematics of Destruction. To truly understand why Warren Buffett is so utterly obsessed with the concept of never losing your baseline capital, you have to completely reprogram the way your brain understands basic middle school mathematics, because the human brain naturally thinks in linear, symmetrical terms, automatically assuming that if you lose 20% of your money in a bad trade, you simply need to make 20% back on the next trade to be whole again. But the financial markets absolutely do not operate on human logic, they operate on the brutal, heavily asymmetrical laws of percentage compounding. If you take $10,000 of your hard-earned savings and you invest it in a highly speculative, incredibly risky asset because some fake guru on the internet confidently promised you it was going to skyrocket, and that asset crashes and loses exactly 50% of its value, you are now left with exactly $5,000. But here is the terrifying mathematical trap that keeps the working class poor forever. To get back to your original $10,000, you do not just need to earn a 50% return, because a 50% return on $5,000 only gives you $2,500, meaning that to simply break even and get back to zero, you actually have to achieve a staggering, incredibly difficult 100% return on your remaining capital, effectively doubling your money just to recover from one single emotional mistake. The math becomes exponentially more violent and catastrophic the more you lose, because if you take a massive, leveraged risk and lose 90% of your portfolio, you do not need a 90% gain to recover. You actually need a miraculous, mathematically impossible 900% gain just to get back to the exact starting line where you began, meaning that taking massive risks to skip the line does not actually accelerate your wealth, it triggers the velocity of ruin, mathematically ensuring that one single bad afternoon can completely erase an entire decade of your hard work and leave you permanently trapped in the exact same financial prison you were trying so desperately to escape. Chapter 2. The Teenage Gambler and the Casino of the Screen. This brutal mathematical reality is exactly why the modern financial system is intentionally designed to act like a highly addictive, flashing digital casino that preys directly on the developing brains of the youngest generation, completely weaponizing the dopamine receptors of teenagers and young adults before they even have a chance to truly understand the devastating, lifelong consequences of risk. Imagine an 18-year-old kid who just got his very first paycheck from a grueling, exhausting summer job, and instead of taking that money and putting it into a boring, low-cost index fund that compounds over 40 years like Warren Buffett relentlessly advises, he opens up a gamified, brightly colored trading app on his glowing smartphone that shoots digital confetti across the screen every time he presses a button, completely disconnecting his brain from the reality that he is actually gambling with the physical hours of his real human labor. He sees a viral, heavily edited video of a guy who claims to have turned $500 into $50,000 overnight by trading extremely complex options contracts or obscure digital coins, so the teenager immediately throws his entire summer paycheck into the exact same massive risk, fully expecting to wake up rich the next morning, but because he is playing a rigged game against highly sophisticated Wall Street algorithms and institutional billionaires who eat retail traders for breakfast, his entire investment goes to absolute zero in a matter of hours. This is not just a temporary financial setback for a young kid, this is a catastrophic psychological event that permanently alters his relationship with money for the rest of his life, because he just experienced the maximum velocity of ruin and learned the highly toxic, inaccurate lesson that the financial markets are just a rigged slot machine, causing him to completely write off the idea of investing forever, meaning the system just successfully extracted his capital and guaranteed that he will remain a lifelong, obedient consumer who trades his finite time for an hourly wage until the day he dies, all because he broke rule number 1 trying to take a rapid shortcut to the finish line. Chapter 3. The Adult Trap and the Illusion of Leverage. If you somehow manage to survive the flashing digital casino of your teenage years with your baseline capital intact, you are immediately thrown into an even more sophisticated, incredibly dangerous, and vastly more expensive financial trap the moment you enter the adult workforce, because the adult does not usually gamble on gamified smartphone apps with their summer paycheck. They gamble with massive, terrifying amounts of borrowed money from giant institutional banks, actively convincing themselves that taking on catastrophic levels of debt is actually the secret weapon of the ultra-rich. Imagine a highly educated, hard-working 35-year-old professional who makes a fantastic six-figure salary, but still feels completely and utterly left behind every single time they open social media and see 22-year-old fake influencers posing in front of rented mansions. So instead of patiently and quietly compounding their money in a boring index fund like Warren Buffett preaches, their ego completely takes over and they decide to take a massive, aggressive shortcut to the finish line by using a financial weapon called leverage. They take the $200,000 they spent a decade painfully saving, and instead of protecting that baseline capital with their life, they use it as a tiny down payment to borrow millions of dollars from the bank to buy highly speculative commercial real estate or extremely risky business ventures, completely blinding themselves with the arrogant assumption that the market is always going to go up and that they are entirely invincible. But the brutal, unforgiving reality of the global economy is that financial winter always comes eventually, and when the market suddenly experiences a violent, completely unexpected 20% correction, the terrifying mathematics of leverage instantly kick in and absolutely obliterate the arrogant adult, because a 20% drop on a massively leveraged portfolio does not just cost you 20% of your money, it triggers a catastrophic margin call from the bank that wipes out 100% of your original $200,000 baseline capital in a single afternoon, leaving you owing millions of dollars on an asset that is completely underwater. This is the exact, agonizing moment where the adult completely violates rule number 1 and rule number 2 simultaneously, because they were so absolutely obsessed with the fantasy of maximizing their potential upside that they completely ignored the catastrophic reality of their potential downside, proving that leverage is a terrifying double-edged sword that will easily cut your head off if you do not have the emotional discipline to respect the math, permanently exiling you back to a corporate cubicle to work for another 30 years just to pay off the devastating mistakes of your own greed. The senior trap and a desperate chase for yield. But perhaps the most heartbreaking, tragic, and mathematically devastating violation of Warren Buffett's sacred rule happens at the very end of the financial journey, when a 65-year-old retiree who has spent 40 grueling, exhausting years working a demanding corporate job finally retires with a decent but terrifyingly finite nest egg, and as they sit in their living room watching the toxic, fear-mongering financial news networks and realizing that global inflation is silently destroying their purchasing power every single day, pure biological panic sets in, forcing them to make a catastrophic emotional decision. Because they are absolutely terrified of running out of money before they die, they look at their incredibly safe, boring government bonds or highly secure savings accounts that are only paying a guaranteed 4% interest rate, and they decide that 4% is simply not enough to survive, so they begin desperately chasing after a dangerously high yield to protect their lifestyle, meaning they take their entire life savings and hand it over to a slick, fast-talking financial salesman who confidently promises them a guaranteed 12% return if they just invest in his highly complex, completely unregulated private fund or obscure digital token. Warren Buffett has famously warned investors about this exact psychological trap for decades, stating that reaching for a high yield is one of the most dangerous and foolish things a human being can do with their capital, because in the financial world, a massive, outsized yield is absolutely never free. It is always directly tied to a massive, hidden, catastrophic risk to your underlying principal, meaning the retiree is essentially risking their entire 40-year life savings just to get an extra 5 or 6% in interest. And when that unregulated fund inevitably collapses under the weight of its own lies, or when that obscure asset goes to absolute zero during a sudden market crash, the retiree does not just lose their expected interest payments, they lose the entire massive block of baseline capital that took them their entire human life to accumulate, and because they are 65 years old, they absolutely do not have the finite time, the physical energy, or the compounding runway to ever make that money back, permanently destroying their golden years and forcing them to become a financial burden on their children, all because they temporarily forgot rule number 1 in a moment of desperate panic. Chapter 5. The true definition of risk and the margin of safety. To truly understand how to stop breaking rule number 1, you have to completely redefine what the word risk actually means in your brain, because Wall Street academics and fancy financial professors will constantly try to tell you that risk is simply the daily volatility of a stock price moving up and down on a chart, but Warren Buffett completely rejects that academic nonsense, defining risk in the absolute simplest and most brutal terms possible as the actual, permanent loss of your underlying capital. When you buy a wonderful, highly profitable, completely dominant business at a fair price, and the stock market decides to throw a massive emotional temper tantrum the next day and drops the price of your stock by 30%, you have not actually lost a single penny of your money as long as you do not panic and sell, because the underlying business is still violently generating free cash flow, still dominating its competitors, and still growing its intrinsic value while the rest of the world loses its mind, meaning daily volatility is not risk. It is actually just a beautiful temporary discount created by the manic depression of other investors. The only true risk in the financial universe is buying a terrible, fundamentally flawed business at an outrageously high price simply because everyone else at the office is talking about it, or investing your hard-earned capital into a complex instrument that you absolutely do not understand. Which brings us to the ultimate, impenetrable shield that Warren Buffett uses to guarantee he never breaks his own rules, known as the margin of safety. If you are building a massive steel bridge across a wide river and you mathematically calculate that the absolute heaviest truck that will ever cross that bridge weighs exactly 10,000 pounds, you build the bridge to hold exactly 10,000 pounds so that if a massive, unpredictable storm hits or if two heavy trucks cross at the exact same time, the bridge absolutely will not collapse and send everyone crashing into the freezing water below. Meaning you must demand such a massive, undeniable discount when you buy an asset that even if the global economy goes into a severe recession, you still will not permanently lose your baseline capital. To successfully apply this critical margin of safety and ensure that you absolutely never violate rule number 1 under any circumstances, you must relentlessly hunt for what Warren Buffett famously calls the economic moat, which is a massive, impenetrable, invisible fortress that permanently protects a fundamentally sound business from being completely destroyed by its ruthless competitors. You are mathematically guaranteeing that your investment will eventually be ground down to zero when a slightly cheaper competitor inevitably enters the market. But when you patiently wait and find a majestic, globally dominant company that possesses a massive, undeniable economic moat, like an incredibly powerful brand identity that consumers are hopelessly addicted to and will pay any price for, or a highly complex technological ecosystem that is incredibly painful and expensive for a user to ever leave, or a massive, low-cost production advantage that literally no other human being on Earth can possibly replicate without spending billions of dollars, you are not just buying a digital piece of paper that violently bounces around on a glowing stock chart, you are actually buying a heavily fortified, bulletproof financial castle. This incredible castle will aggressively and violently defend your baseline capital through severe economic recessions, massive global supply chain panics, and terrifying periods of high inflation. Meaning the absolute best way to obey rule number 1 and rule number 2 is to completely stop acting like a panicked, emotional day trader who constantly gambles on the unpredictable daily weather of the stock market, and start acting like a ruthless, calculating, unemotional business owner who only buys impregnable fortresses that are mathematically guaranteed to survive the siege. The psychology of patience and the ultimate weapon. The ultimate undeniable truth about Warren Buffett's 2 rules of money is that they are not actually about complex mathematics, predicting the future, or reading boring accounting spreadsheets for 12 hours a day. They are fundamentally about deeply mastering your own chaotic, biological human psychology, because the entire modern financial system is a highly engineered multi-trillion-dollar machine explicitly designed from the ground up to ruthlessly transfer wealth from the hyperactive, the impatient, and the greedy, directly into the quiet, boring, unshakable pockets of the deeply patient. Every single time you feel that sudden, burning biological urge to take a massive, leveraged risk on a highly speculative asset just because your broke neighbor or a viral influencer was bragging about their temporary success, or every time you feel the terrifying, heart-pounding panic to completely sell all of your magnificent, heavily moated businesses just because a highly paid news anchor is screaming about a temporary economic crisis on the television, you must violently stop yourself, take a deep breath, and remember the devastating mathematics of the velocity of ruin. You must realize in that exact moment of weakness that simply surviving the financial game and fiercely protecting your baseline capital from permanent loss is infinitely more important than desperately trying to double your money by next Tuesday to impress strangers on the internet, because the miraculous, world-changing magic of compound interest only actually works if you have the emotional fortitude to stay in the game long enough to let the exponential math take over and do the heavy lifting for you over a period of decades. The final blueprint, waking up to reality. You absolutely do not need to be a mathematical genius, an Ivy League financial scholar, or a lucky lottery winner to build a massive financial empire that completely changes your family tree forever and buys back the finite hours of your human life. You simply need the cold, stoic, emotional discipline to completely ignore the toxic, manic noise of the terrified crowd, the unparalleled patience to wait years for the perfect, heavily discounted pitch, and the absolute, unwavering commitment to fiercely protect your capital from the devastating, ruinous trap of your own human greed. So stop trying to aggressively skip the line, stop trying to get rich quick by playing a rigged casino game you mathematically cannot win, and start rigorously obeying the only 2 unshakable rules that actually matter in the brutal game of wealth. Because the second you stop losing money to your own impatience is the exact second you finally start building your empire. Thank you so much for watching this documentary, and if you are truly ready to completely rewire your financial mind, abandon the highly dangerous illusions of the middle class, and master the true, boring, undeniable physics of generational wealth, make sure to hit that subscribe button to join the Pratibodh Wisedom community right now, and I will see you in the next one.